Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Danish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And once again, we have a wonderful guest with us, Sonali Kolhatkar. And the topic is quite topical for what's going on right now. In the region, actually, not right now, what's been going on, particularly in our part of the world for the past 2 decades. But of course, in light of the announcement this year, but of course, now for a couple of years of this, the mantra of of a U.S. withdrawal coming any day now, and so on, and now we have President Biden saying that the U.S. will withdraw its forces from Afghanistan by September the 11th of this year. So this is why we really wanted to do a show, and perhaps other shows as well, because of the nature of and the proximity of what's going on in Afghanistan, its impact not only on Pakistan but as its centrality within this whole global so-called war on terror that's existed over the past 2 decades. And as I said on my intro on my Facebook, that we could have no one better than Sonali to address this question. Her wonderful book that I can't recommend highly enough. I still think it's the best book on the subject. It could be 10 years old. It could be written 2002, but it is certainly my favorite book, and that's Bleeding Afghanistan: Washington, Warlords, and the Propaganda of Silence. I recommend it to all of you to read. And Sonali also runs a show, Rising Up with Sonali. I myself have had the privilege to actually be with Sonali on a few occasions, discussing developments within Pakistan itself. So, without further ado, I want to welcome you, Sonali, to the show. So, Sonali, I can't hear you. Are you?
Here we go.
Okay, there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No, you're most welcome, and we are the one that are very honored to actually have you. So, Sonali, let's get right into it. Um, I wanted to talk about two themes, as we mentioned. One is an assessment, although in some ways here, and of course, this is not just we don't have a Pakistani viewership, we have a global viewership, but uh, there is obviously a sense here of how badly this war has gone. Badly would be putting it kind of in more diplomatic terms, in terms of disastrously this war has been waged both within Afghanistan and its spillover effects within Pakistan over the past 2 decades. But I wanted to get you to kind of give your assessment of what the U.S. kind of wanted to accomplish, its war aims. Of course, we know that the United States has a long history of kind of publicly announcing what it wants to achieve, and then what the war and these occupations are all about, and so on. We have seen that most graphically in Iraq, in which many people, including many liberals, have kind of called that out, have critiqued that in very scathing ways. But we have seen that Afghanistan, the longest running external war at least of the United States, if you disregard the internal war against Native Americans within the United States, but if it almost seems that that has been off the radar screens for many Americans, deliberately kept that way by elites and the propaganda industry to kind of continue to wage that war year after year after year. And so that is why I think that not talking not just about, which we'll get to, the announcement about the withdrawal right now, but also about kind of what these past 2 decades have meant, and what they have accomplished or not accomplished, and the nature of it is very important. So first, Sonali, if I can just ask you to give a critical assessment of what this of the war in Afghanistan over these past 2 decades, what's been achieved, what's not been achieved, and your view of what it has looked like. So if you can
I
address that.
think I think it's actually a really good thing to pay attention to what Afghanistan's former president Hamid Karzai himself had to say this week. If you want an honest assessment of what's happened in Afghanistan, he was, for your audience, maybe you're familiar with Hamid Karzai. He was the original president of Afghanistan. He was installed by the United States. He was seen as a puppet president. He did go on to actually win an election and then became a democratically elected president and left office rather disillusioned, even though he was an instrument of US colonialism and foreign policy in Afghanistan. Well, this week, in an interview with the Associated Press, he said that the United States has utterly failed in Afghanistan. The US had two objectives. One was to defeat extremism, and the other was to create stability in political stability in Afghanistan. And according to Karzai, the US utterly failed on both those counts. And he said that this is what we've gotten. We've gotten, the highest level of extremism in Afghanistan in 2 decades happening now, and the country entirely unstable. And it's a direct result of what the US has done. Therefore, the US, it's better for everybody that the United States leaves. It's incredible to hear Karzai, a man who was part and parcel, a central figure in the US's occupation, to have this assessment. And it's a real pity that he and others like him did not listen to those of us who in 2001 predicted with great ease that the United States occupation would fail. All we had to do was look at the history of US colonialism in other countries and understand that the US never invades another nation for the good of those people living there. The US only enters into other nations when it has its own interests at stake. And once within another country, will carry out operations in order to further its interests. And so any people who are occupied need to know that they end up being pawns in the US's grand chess game. And often that chess game is played in such a flawed way that even the US fails in its own objectives. So the objectives are poor, and then the carrying out of those objectives are done so poorly, with such negligence and such violence. And that's essentially what's happened in Afghanistan. On paper, you have a country with a constitution where there's, there's some nominal equality set in stone for men and women, but you have Sharia law is considered to be supreme over all law, and the fundamentalist warlords that the US installed use that as a bludgeon against civil society, secularism. And of course, you have the return of the Taliban, which the US chose to engage with over and over again. Even though the Taliban was supposed to be the enemy, the US chose to partner with the Taliban for peace. And now the Taliban is very predictably returning to those very places that the US had occupied. The entire war has been
they called one of the worst regimes ever in the history of mankind, the Taliban that's being negotiated with now,
Absolutely. I mean, it's remarkable that if the US wanted peace, and we're talking about both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, then of course the Biden administration didn't have much choice, but the Obama and the Trump administrations chose to partner with the Taliban to the exclusion of their own partners, which is the Afghan government, and of course civil society, secular forces, human rights organizations. Everybody else was excluded. So they chose to work with the militant fundamentalist armed faction who had originally held Afghanistan, taken it over, essentially saying to them, you can have the country back. And for Afghans on the ground, it's terrible, terrible news. Of course, the United States staying in Afghanistan is no better. But to leave, handing the country back to the Taliban, is the worst possible way to leave.
So two things there, Sonali. One is that stepping back, and what you were saying is incredibly important. The way that this, in some ways, is of course nothing new in the history of U.S. foreign adventurism and colonialism in general, and going out and occupying for their own interests. But some of the enabling rhetoric that was deployed to invade Afghanistan seemed to capture the imagination of not only Americans the world over, because it came after September the 11th, and the idea that this was a war to especially save Muslim women from the Taliban. And so, how could it be such a bad war? And this goes into the kind of narrative that, of course, Obama pushed very strongly. That, of course, Iraq was the huge mistake, but of course, Afghanistan was the good war because all of these intentions were so great. So that on the one hand, and on the second hand, the Taliban on the one hand is, of course, we know the record of that, but the people that the United States put in power, and the whole kind of lot of them, of these, the warlords that you speak about in your book, some of the most corrupt, and the amount of kind of money that went into Afghanistan, and that was I mean, corruption was rife. So it was like a disaster on both fronts.
It was as if the United States was interested in nothing other than a show of being in Afghanistan. So you're right, the enormous amount of money that was poured into Afghanistan, much of which didn't end up going to doing the right things. I mean, I would have been happy to have stood corrected 2 decades later if the United States had proved analysts like me and you and others wrong in carrying out some wonderful occupation that would have been, resulted in women and girls finally being freed to go to school and live in safety and democratic secular forces. But of course, we know that the United States didn't intend that. Now, at the end of this week, you have the current president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, and his vice president, Abdullah, coming to the United States for a state visit. And for anybody who knows Afghanistan's history, and we write about it in our book, Abdullah is one of those warlords, one of these, they used to be called the Mujahideen, the jihadi warlords who the US partnered with when they renamed themselves the Northern Alliance, because for a minute they set aside their differences and their weapons against each other down and joined forces against the Taliban and joined the US. And the US rewarded them with political power, with money, with cash, with weapons, and installed them within the government. So you already have this government that was set up to fail, rife with corruption, and now reaching the highest levels of government. And then the US even abandoned them. This Afghan government, a weak, ineffectual government, corrupt government, abandoned, almost as an admission of how poorly all of this was carried out. But you have a country right now that is devastated. In 2001, it was devastated from the Soviet occupation, from the civil war that the US essentially fueled.
Yeah, this is important. I mean, this is the kind of how long this country has been undergoing a state of war, and the impact of that on human beings. I think that's very important that you bring up.
Yeah, and in fact, in 2001, I mean, you're in Pakistan, one of the largest refugee crises in the world were Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And of course, Iran had a secondary population. But you had huge numbers of Afghan refugees that had fled not just the Taliban, but the civil war in the early 80s, fled Afghanistan, early 90s, I'm sorry, and gone into Pakistan, were living in squalid conditions in Pakistani refugee camps. And, the United States came in making these promises. And I do recall that in 2001, although there were some very radical progressives like Howard Zinn, who immediately spoke out against the war. There were unfortunately lots of liberals here in the United States who did support the war as a good war. They were very clear on the Iraq war, which of course unfolded a year or so later, or a few months later. But on the Afghanistan front, it was like, well, since that's directly linked to September 11th, that's a good war. That is a war that, this goes unsaid, but that preserves American imperial prestige. America was hit. We must hit back. Iraq didn't hit us. If Iraq had hit us, that war would have been legitimate. And that was the sort of liberal logic. And of course, if we start from the premise and from the fundamental basis that we respect humanity, respect human rights, and that Afghan people are the same as American people, and deserve safety and security, then the Afghan war too was absolutely not a good war.
Right. I mean, the earlier point you made is that folks like you and I would have been, of course, incredibly content if the things that you said they actually did. Whether it's yes, girls' education, infrastructure development in the country, all sorts of things that they could have done. But then you ask yourself the question: we live in these neoliberal times where they're not doing this stuff at home. Why
Yeah.
would they be doing this stuff in countries abroad? This is not post World War II Marshall Plan type of that type of a program in Afghanistan, and that's what it's led to. And add to that the kind of both the both the corruption and the incompetence of the Afghan government, as well as the incredible arrogance and the terror of the U.S. occupation itself, that you document very well, that has kind of led to what I would call what I would point to the papers, the Afghanistan papers, kind of like the Pentagon papers, that you're more than familiar with, that basically that basically argue that these generals sitting in Afghanistan, year after year, they're lying about kind of the quote unquote progress being made in Afghanistan. So maybe
And
you want to
that's
mention that
yeah,
a
that's
little
what
bit.
we in our book we were the subtitle of our book is Washington Warlords and the Propaganda of Silence. And
Yeah,
that's that propaganda of silence that we refer to. Afghanistan has always, for the last 2 decades, suffered from a lack of coverage in the
yeah,
media. And when there's been media coverage, it's been, of course, absolutely terrible. It has given the impression over and over again that things are going well, that if we are to leave, if we would leave, then things would get much worse.
right,
I recall, famous covers of magazines showing mutilated faces of Afghan women with the caption, "This is what would happen if we left," failing to mention that it was happening while we were there.
right,
And the Afghanistan papers, which the Washington Post published, were basically this trove of internal documents from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, which is a watchdog agency that they had in their internal discussions found to have found to have exposed this massive lie of
yeah,
the so-called progress in Afghanistan being presented to the American public, because of course it's funded by the American public,
yeah,
and on the ground you had absolute ineffectual corruption, violence, drone attacks, civilian casualties, girls' schools being shut down, suicide bombings over and over again from all of these forces, including American forces. And if the American people had been made aware of that, if even papers like the Washington Post had put those issues front and center on their front pages for the last 2 decades, this war would have ended a lot sooner. Not only would it have, of course, saved American dollars, most importantly, it would have saved Afghan lives, which ultimately is what this discussion should be all about. The beleaguered citizens of one of the poorest nations in the world that has
right,
been a proxy, whose nation has been a proxy battleground for the big nations of the world, and that have never, there are children now in their 30s, or people in their 30s who were born during war
right.
and who have not known peace in their entire lifetimes. And that is a tragedy. And because of the way in which the United States is leaving, they will not know peace, because they will see their country completely devastated by the Taliban. And I'm really scared for my friends in Afghanistan and for the people of this beautiful nation, one of the most beautiful nations in the world,
Yeah,
most historic nations in the world, with such rich cultural legacy and history. And its
yes.
people have just been used, abused, and now abandoned by the world.
Right. No, that's very well put and poignantly put, Sonali. And I think that we can actually turn to this now question, and which kind of you pointed to. I mean, this whole now notion of an American withdrawal after these 2 decades, and after these Afghanistan papers have come out demonstrating a whole series of lies about a whole lot of things, including what I said earlier, the idea that yes, we're making progress against the Taliban, which I mean, control actually far more in actual real terms territory than they did even in on when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. So I mean, this has been a complete farce. Um, but the question that I want to get to now is that of this U.S. withdrawal, and kind of you hinted at a kind of prognosis of what you think is going to happen. But first, before that, um, the U.S. withdrawal itself. Do you first of all, people here will be skeptical and first ask you, is it for real? I mean, is it really going to happen? But that's the first part, but the second part is that the devil is in the details. Is it a withdrawal of U.S. forces? Will Bagram Air Force the air base go away? What about all these private military contractors that way outnumber actual U.S. forces there, as well as the air power
Right.
that still remains? So there's all these questions that sort of linger, and I don't know if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that. Yeah.
It's really important to get into these details because you're right in implying that the private contractors are going to stay. Already, you have there's a good word for them. They're mercenaries. These are paid
Yes.
soldiers, and so because they're privately contracted, although paid for by U.S. tax dollars, they have less accountability. They operate in the shadows. Their crimes are not hardly nearly enough addressed. They are not nearly often enough held accountable, if ever. And the United States understands that the political cost of keeping U.S. troops in Afghanistan is too high because
Right.
Americans are tired of war. So they're pulling out troops, they're keeping in contractors, and they're switching the war from what was a combination air and ground war to a primarily air war. So the drone strikes will continue. As far as I know, from what the generals have said publicly, General Lloyd Austin, former General Lloyd Austin, currently the head of the Defense Department, Pentagon chief in the U.S., said, we're going to basically do in Afghanistan what we've been doing in Somalia, which is a drone war.
Right.
And Pakistanis know very well, of
Yeah.
course, especially those living in the Northwest Frontier Province,
Of course.
what that drone war looks like, how it's essentially not just, not a war on terror, it's a war of terror.
Right.
And so the US is going to switch it up, primarily make it a drone war, which means terror from the skies for civilians, more civilian contractors. And then that's going to be presented to us as, look, the war is over, American
Right.
soldiers have left. And we have to be extremely careful about that. When the US first launched the war in Afghanistan, two very important geopolitical achievements of that war was that now that for the first time, the US had military bases in Russia and China's backyard,
Yeah.
closest that the US has ever gotten to those two countries, which of course in these
Yes.
political times, we're hearing so much about the US and Russia and China. And the other was that it gave NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a reason to continue to exist. This was, of course, the
Right.
organization that was meant to be the counter to the Soviet Union, since the Soviet
Right.
Union no longer
So all
existed.
of a sudden, it goes from Europe all the way to
Yeah, and so I don't
Afghanistan.
think
Right.
I think that the United States does not. My educated guess on this, and it is an educated guess, is that the United States will not want to let go of those two aspects, giving NATO a chance to, keep itself relevant. Which NATO, by the way, is fighting the U.S. on the on withdrawing troops, and I suspect President Biden will allow NATO troops, or will not pick a fight with NATO over this. So there may still be NATO troops remaining. And two is that the military bases, I doubt that the US will want to undo that achievement, that investment that they made in keeping that base close to the Russia and China borders. But by and large, you'll see less coverage of crimes committed. I don't know how many of your viewers have been paying attention to this interesting political debate in the US. Speaking of Somalia, we have a Somali American
Right.
Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, who has gotten into great trouble for saying basically that the US's own atrocities, the US commits atrocities without accountability. And she's absolutely right. I mean, Afghanistan is a perfect case in point for how the US has not been held accountable in spite of efforts at the International Criminal Court to hold US the United
Yes.
States accountable for its crimes, to get justice for the US's crimes in Afghanistan. And we likely will never see justice. So it's really important for us to understand, and I'm glad you asked that question, that this withdrawal is going to be more of a pivot rather than a withdrawal.
Right. No, no. Yes, I think this has been on the minds of many people that either are skeptical or either are too excited about what's going to happen with this quote unquote U.S. withdrawal. The final thing, Sonali, I will ask you more to see if there's some iota of optimism that we can get from this situation, and that would be any idea that you would, advance about how to quote unquote stabilize. And I'm not using the term stabilize the way elites of these countries use it in terms of, but in some ways, yes, the reduction and hopefully the end of violence. But what do you think that it would take at this point to kind of bring some semblance of a reduction of violence and some type of truce in some ways between the warring factions, whether it's the Taliban and the Afghan quote unquote puppet government and the other warlords associated with it. Any ideas on that, Sonali?
Well, we do need to have accountability for crimes. And so if there is a way to bring cases forward at the International Criminal Court in a way that the United States cannot squash them, that is important, because these fundamentalist armed forces that have been unleashed in Afghanistan need to be delegitimized and they need to be disarmed. You hear a lot of talk from the liberal supporters of the war who say, well, we need to make sure everyone has a seat at the table. This is a very common language that you're like, women should have a seat at the table. And, we want to ensure that civil society has a seat at the table. But you're asking unarmed people who believe in democracy, who believe in women's rights, who don't have access to weapons and don't want weapons, to sit at the same table with a person holding a gun to their head, and who doesn't believe that they necessarily have the same rights as maybe men do or particular ethnicities do. And somehow that is supposed to result in some nice pie in the sky consensus, and it's not going to happen. We need an international, either a body or a convening that truly has the interests of Afghan people at heart, that is going to help with justice for crimes committed, disarmament, and an allowing of democratic secular forces to flourish. I'm not at all optimistic that such a thing could ever happen, considering what is unfolded in Afghanistan now. It might have been possible 20 years ago. It might even have been somewhat possible 10 years ago. But today, with the Taliban as empowered as they are, it's critical that we, first of all, start pulling back the forces that are hurting Afghanistan, the US being one of them, the contractors paid for by the US being another one, the Taliban, the Afghan warlords, all of these forces. And then, Russia and Pakistan's government, India's government, Iran's government, they all have interests in Afghanistan that go beyond respecting human rights, and that don't necessarily further human rights in either their own countries or in Afghanistan. Although these countries do have interests and may need to be part of a solution, they can't be driving the solution. 20 years ago, RAWA, the group that I've worked with, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, were backing as a flawed solution, but the only one at hand, some sort of United Nations-led peacekeeping. They didn't like the idea of armed peacekeepers, but they also didn't like the idea of living under the Taliban. I don't know if those things are possible anymore, but we need some kind of international gathering to support the people of Afghanistan. And that does mean disempowering the armed fundamentalist forces. You can't have both at the table. You have to choose between secular democracy versus armed fundamentalism. And the rest of the world has been only too happy to work with the armed fundamentalists while paying lip service to the rights of the secular Democrats. And that has to end. You can't have it both ways.
Right. I think you hit the nail on the head. I was trying to kind of almost coerce you to kind of get some optimism, but even myself, I mean, it's just that all of these factions, and not just the Taliban, they are armed and they are almost equally fundamentalist and so on and so forth. So it in some ways, as you mentioned, the countries that have been the patrons of some of these forces, um, despite their own kind of situations and human rights abuses, um, it does seem like one of the first steps that can be taken. That's incredibly important, obviously, for the Afghan people, just on basic humanitarian levels, is kind of the reduction of violence, the disarmament of these forces, and tell them to kind of course, that's just a very first step
Yeah.
to a whole lot of things that would need to be done. But I really do agree with you that at this stage, it seems like the regional actors that have been so much involved in this, and in some ways, their argument is that, well, if the United States can be involved thousands of miles away, well, this is a bordering country that we
Yeah.
have to be concerned about as well. So it does seem like the regional players
Yeah.
will have to get involved in some
And
way, because yeah,
yeah,
please.
I do have one. I do want to say one thing in terms of the optimism. One of the things that we saw over the past 20 years in Afghanistan was, in spite of everything that people had to put up with, we discovered that there was this incredible, and it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us.
Yeah.
It is a surprise to some people. There's this incredible thirst for democracy in Afghanistan. So in those moments and in those spaces where Afghans had the choice or the opportunity to cast their ballots, it didn't matter if 70% of the population can't read or write. The elections were run in such a way that they didn't need to, that they could identify by faces, and there were some local campaigns that ran. My most favorite example is the campaign of Malalai Joya from Farah province
Yes.
in Afghanistan, in the western part of Afghanistan, who was this young activist. She was very young when she was first elected, and her people came together to elect her, to choose her, men and women alike, sent her to Kabul to represent them. And they were so excited to have the chance and the choice to send this incredible human rights activist. And so, and there were other stories similar to that in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So there is this thirst for democracy, this desire for democracy. After all, why shouldn't there be? Any people of any country in the world want the chance to choose their nation's direction and choose to have control over their lives. And it's the same in Afghanistan. It doesn't matter if it's a Muslim country. It doesn't matter if it's a poor, war-torn country with low literacy rates, with terrible record on women's rights and human rights. None of that matters. The people, when given the chance, will choose democracy when given the chance. And I think that's a huge, important point we have to remember. And that deserves our attention.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'll end on this, but I'll say that I'm so happy that you raised her name, because it then reminds us also. I mean, and of course, I have enormous respect for her. I met her in Vancouver, and the principled politics of this woman. It then reminds me, not only have we been discussing about all of these terrible factions within Afghanistan itself, but of course, the United States also does not abhors a character like Malaya Joya as well, because of her politics of basically for a very long time against the occupation itself, and the exacerbation of the chaos and the mess in the country.
The U.S., despite wanting to pay lip service to women's rights, several years ago, might have been about 10 years ago now, I can't really quite remember, denied Malalai Joya a visa to the United States. We had scheduled an incredible event for her to speak alongside Noam Chomsky, and she barely made it to the auditorium in time. Her earlier engagements in the Boston area had to be canceled because she couldn't catch a flight out, because they had basically denied her the visa. And I was on the phone with the State Department because my organization Afghan Women's Mission had organized this tour, and trying to reach somebody and almost try to shame them into giving her the
Wow.
visa, saying that you claim to be for women's rights. Here's a leading Afghan women's rights organizer and
Right.
activist and parliamentarian, and you aren't letting her into the United States. Shame on you. Of course, they did eventually, but initially they denied it, and that wasn't surprising to me, because the U.S. has tried to have it both ways. Look, we're for women's rights, but we're supporting these anti-women people.
Right. Absolutely. Sonali, I'm so sorry. We'll have to end it here. I would love to have you on for hours and hours, but I'm so, thankful and grateful for the time that you've given us. And I think all of our viewership, my students, colleagues, our global viewership, like I said, we could not get a better voice on this question of what's been going on in Afghanistan than yourself. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Appreciate it, Junaid. Thanks so much for having me.